There's two patterns of unhealthy personal boundaries, and both of them could be quietly damaging your emotional health. On the topic of personal boundaries, I routinely come across people that fall into two categories of unhealthy behavior patterns. Unfortunately, these patterns can cause damage to relationships, how a person feels about themselves, their physical health. Maybe their inner critic gets activated, and it can even impact your leisure time. Welcome back to my Less Stress More Zest podcast. Each month I focus on a theme of challenges, struggles, and experiences from my clients, my community, and my own lived experiences. Today we're going to look at and discuss the two patterns of unhealthy behaviors and the impact they can have, and then talk about how you can move towards healthier boundaries and give your life a lift. Welcome. My name is Nicholas Dob. I'm a resilience coach. I'm a trauma therapist and the founder of ZestQuest. With me again, I've got Leanne James from Lotus Energies. She's a counselor, a coach, and energy practitioner. Leanne, lovely to have you here. I enjoy your presence and looking forward to your input.
Thank you, Nicholas. It's always great to be here with you. It's always great to have these type of conversations because we do know that these things genuinely matter. They're really important to others and conversations and communication. And I really enjoy these conversations that we have even outside of podcasts. You mentioned just before that there's two behavior patterns specifically around personal boundaries that have a negative impact on relationships and other things, as you sort of glossed over a little bit. I'm sure we'll get into that. But it sounds pretty serious.
Yes, and it actually is serious because there's cost to having unhealthy personal boundaries. Can affect your emotional well-being, your mental well-being, and your physical well-being. What's like it can manifest as anxiety, as resentment, poor sleep patterns, and digestive issues. More personally, it can affect your sense of identity, that you lose part of your identity. The inner critic gets activated and the list goes on.
There's a lot that's impacted by unhealthy or poor boundaries, right? Wow. You mentioned there's like key things that you've noticed in your practice. Would you expand just a little bit on that before we get into the heavier stuff, the deeper stuff?
Yes, certainly. Conventional conversations in psychology and around the place and just in regular conversations with people in society that talk about core boundaries, they often focus in almost exclusively one type of behavior pattern. And that's the person who gives too much, known as the people pleaser or the fawner. They're the ones who say yes until they just can't go on. And it causes emotional and relational damage. What I've noticed is a contrasting set of behaviors, and it's not talked about much, and certainly not in the same light that people please. That these are the people that have overly rigid boundaries. They tend to shut others out. They won't ask for help. Then they won't accept help if it's offered. These people too have got issues that are affecting them. The fallout for them, strong and self-sufficient on the outside, but they too are going to end up with emotional and relational issues and damage.
Yeah, well, you're using the word damage, and I guess there's a wound under all of these things, that these two particular boundaries that you're talking about, types of people. Can you give us a bit more about that? Like, tell us a little bit more about the people pleaser for a start. Let's just start with that one because that's the one we know the most, right?
That's right. People pleasers, they're often referred to as having porous or weak boundaries, that they're a pushover and people can walk all over them because they're really accommodating and too flexible. They've got an emotional door that's like just always left open. Anyone can just walk through. There's no checklist. There's no one's managing or filtering it. These are the people that say yes to almost everything, even though every cell in their body's screaming, no, I don't want to do it. They just don't know how to say no. They feel personally responsible for every person in the room or the work environment, wherever it happens to be. One of the key facets of a people pleaser is they will avoid conflict at all costs. It's like one of their primary motivators. They're often seen as kind, and in that kindness, they're waiting for reciprocated. Unfortunately, they're usually disappointed. And it doesn't mean they've got to try harder. they're doing things for other people, and that builds resentment. And that, when they acknowledge their resentment, unfortunately, they get a second layer of guilt about being resentful, because being resentful may cause the very thing that they're trying to avoid, and that's disconnection.
Wow, there's a spiraling going on. I can probably feel it from my past as well. It's going from one negative sort of feeling and emotion to another, and not getting out of that loop. Surely there's a bottom to all of that. Surely there's something that's at the core and the base of that sort of behavior and boundary.
That's right. You heard me, or you mentioned earlier about having wounds, and I call them emotional wounds. What's underneath typical people pleasers is what they call the fawn response. This is something that's identified by a psychologist, Pete Walker, who did a lot of work with complex PTSD. And the fawn response is now being adapted as the fourth trauma response. Everyone would be with fight, flight, and freeze. Now add in fawn. What does that mean? It means that they're the people who will appease anything that represents danger. They're going to appease the person that is any kind of threat or discomfort to them. Then fighting or running away, they'll just do something very accommodating and avoid any discomfort for the other person, but at their own expense. Another key thing with people pleasers, they get these labels of being too nice, not having a backbone. I've heard people say, well, they've just got to learn to say no. And it's fundamentally flawed to say something like that, because what's really happening is that there's a trauma response underneath it all.
Understand that. I actually noticed that in the abuse counseling when I was doing that people would say, just leave. But it's not as easy as just say no, just leave. It's not. So it's a bit more about that, the trauma response there.
Well, for the what we call the fawning response, typically happens when someone's young, when they're growing up, and their nervous system it's actually learned a survival strategy. They may have come from an environment where there's a parent that is inconsistent, sometimes loving, sometimes not. And when they're not, well, maybe they get a little bit uptight. The child learns to calm the parent. They're predicting moods, they're treading, and they're being small and as non-threatening as they can be. So they're kind of diminishing themselves. And that's what kept them safe. Here they were doing whatever they could to keep safe, when safe always wasn't a guaranteed thing. I had a client, I'll call her Kimberly to protect her identity, but she was in her early 40s, and in the workplace, she was just smick. She was absolutely wonderful. Everyone loved her. Whatever they asked her to do, she would do. She said yes. She stayed late. She started early, helped everyone, and she was that kind of go-to person. Unfortunately for Kimberly, it looked like she was doing really well on the outside. Internally, she was just drained and exhausted. She had broken sleep and was starting to have some health issues because she really couldn't switch off. Survival mechanism, in a way, was looking after everybody else. We started to talk about this, and I said to Kimberly, what is it that you'd really want to? And I sat and waited as she was there in silence initially. And she started this gentle crying. And when eventually she could speak, she just said, I don't know. I didn't even know I could want anything. And that sort of thing saddens me, and it's not the first time I've seen it either. Kimberly really didn't know because she'd lost her identity. She'd given it away to everybody else, to please everybody else. That is what chronic fawning can look like. It can be exhausting and erode who.
That's not just a mental state, it becomes a physical state, which becomes a mental state, and there's that loop again, isn't it? That spiral that just keeps impacting every part of one's life and existence. So there's a pattern there underneath. Is there something that starts that off again? Could just share a bit more on that one?
Yes, certainly, Leanne. Again, most of this stuff starts in childhood, and every child wants to be loved and accepted and nurtured. And when the child is faced with times when they're not feeling loved and nurtured, then there's some sort of disparity there. And they take on what they call an anxious attachment. And there's a whole thing around attachment theory. But so that's when they typically have parents or caregivers that are inconsistent. Maybe they're super wonderful, they're loving, providing good environment, but emotionally they may not be as present as they could be at other times. And so the child feeling a loss, feeling they might not be lovable, is going to do whatever they can. They're looking to their parent or caregiver as their primary source of safety. When the parents aren't providing that, the nervous system goes into overdrive and the child does what they can to feel safe. And that means they take on behaviors such as reading the room, reading the mood of a person. And they realize that for them, connection to their parent or caregiver is fragile. They put themselves out to look after those situations and they just become endlessly accommodating. So the fawn response and the anxious attachment are basically two sides of the same coin, and that's what sets up the people pleaser set of behaviors. And they're both driven from this basically terror of losing connection, being rejected, that not getting their needs met. They learned that by being agreeable and useful, that there's a better chance that their parent will like them a little bit more and a little bit longer. It's unfortunate, but that's what happens in how the people pleaser's personality is really developed. Those behaviors kind of work. They kind of get something out of it, where the parent's a little more calm and relationships can be a little bit more stable when they're in adult life. But really, there's an erosion happening and it's not sustainable long term, and there'll always be a fallout somewhere along the line. One of the other things that, there's beliefs that happen underneath this as well. And those beliefs essentially are like lies that these, now adults are running with, and that started when they were very young. Who they just organically are as a child, they believe is not lovable, that love is conditional, or that they have to earn their place in the world.
Sounds very familiar. There's a lot of people around that would identify with this. That is a very relatable experience. Whether or not that many really get down to that bottom level so that it can be healed and moved into something of a healthier relationship with themselves and with the adults around them that raised them, perhaps. Fascinating stuff. Fascinating. If you could tie a little bow in the people pleaser so we can move on, but is there anything more that you want to add to the people pleaser so we can understand it?
I think I've kind of outlaid it that, this all began for a means of looking for satisfying their internal needs of being loved and nurtured, keeping the connections that are important to them.
Cool. Thank you. Because I'm excited to find out more about the people preventers, which you shared a little bit with me prior to this podcast. I love the term, actually, because I can just see it. It's really a strong visual there. It's not something I've heard of before in the mental health language, the vocabulary that's out there in official mainstream. There's got to be something that you're going to enlighten us with on that and how that impacts relationships, not just with ourselves, but, in our adult lives too. Share some more about that one.
Absolutely. When I was doing a lot of research and noticing patterns within my clients, and I couldn't find a term in the psychology language that really captured the whole arrangement of thoughts, feelings, emotions, drivers, motivators, etc., and sets of behaviors like people pleasers does. And so I actually coined the term people preventers to fill that gap. And it just seems to work really well. And when I have shared it and then can reference it, clients and others I've shared this with seem to get it straight away. It has the same benefit of categorizing type of behaviors like people pleasers. Now we have people preventers. They're the people with the rigid boundaries and tend to shut other people out from their inner world. In literature, in the psychology world, the parallels, if you like, are avoidant attachment and hyper-independence. These are the traits that are really common for the people preventer personality. And so it's relational, but it's other things as well. And it's a relationship with themselves. Underlying a lot of what happens with people preventers is they lose close connection with people because they're actually preventing it through their firm boundaries and behaviors. What I see with them that talked about emotional door with the people pleasers, they have a door, but their emotional door, it's closed and then bolted and then double locked. and it's barricaded and the furniture's put in front of it and no one can get through.
Sounds like they might be protecting themselves.
Very much so.
What does their day-to-day look like?
Well, they've got different struggles to the people pleaser. The people preventers, they have a deep resistance to asking for help. And one part of them might be going, oh, I'd really love some help. Like, why doesn't someone just offer to help? But underneath, that is just horrific for them. They couldn't face asking for help because that would, in their world, be seen as weakness or a flaw in their character and those sorts of things. Just the same, if someone was to offer them help, they'd be super uncomfortable. In fact, that could even be threatening. And it is threatening for some. They keep, even their loved ones, they keep them at arm's length. When I talk to partners or family members of a people preventer, the things I hear, they're hard to reach. They're hard to really know what they're thinking and feeling. They don't express any emotions, all these sorts of things. They've got suppressed emotions. That's why others can't see or get in touch with their emotions. They don't do vulnerability. That's a no-no, because vulnerability, that is a weakness, and they have to keep up this hard armor in a way and prevent people from getting to. What's interesting though, for a lot of these people from the outside and surface, they just look so competent, reliable. These are the people they don't ever have any dramas. They're just so self-sufficient and on top of it all. They got it all together. Mm. I tell you what, in a crisis, they're the ones that are going to get things done. You probably want them around at some point. But unfortunately, they've got unhealthy drivers there. They've got different set of beliefs, and they've got the things like, I don't need anyone. If I need someone, that's weakness. If I need something done, I'll do it on my own. Mm. What happens is people around them reinforce this, they're so reliable and self-sufficient model. That actually reinforces the isolation that they've set up.
A family member that says, I don't do emotion, and a high achiever too, and the one to go to when you want something done, and fact. But the heart is a bit closed off because of previous experiences, definitely. Funny that you mentioned that society is sort of like, yeah, we look for the high achiever. We think that success is here and we've got to go all the time. And yet there's losses in it. I guess society is in some way setting up that type of behavioral imprint to continue on with some people.
Absolutely. You're spot on there, Leanne. They're actually rewarding the trauma response. Inadvertently, of course. Because of this, the people preventer isn't getting that external feedback that anything's wrong. It only validates their behavior and they continue the pattern. It's locked in, reinforcing. They can go many years, in fact, they can go decades without crisis, recognizing that there's something inside them that's slowly being eroded as well. Part of them is kind of dying off. And they don't realize that they're missing out on genuine connection and intimacy. And that part which is, well, just human.
Yeah.
I hear from clients that are fallen into this category, the people preventers, that they feel really lonely, even when they're amongst workmates or amongst family and that sort of thing. But they have this, because they've set themselves up with isolation, they still feel lonely. Got another client I'd like to tell you about, a man in his late 50s this time, and I'm going to give him the name of Samuel. He came to me not because he had any major breakdown, but his wife of about 22 years was saying that she felt completely alone. He cared for her, but he didn't know how to care for her. There was some strain in the marriage. Samuel's a good provider. He was faithful. He showed up. He was a doer and got things done. But apparently his wife had said it was like living with a roommate, and they'd lost that close connection. He did acknowledge that, even though there was a part of him I could see wasn't really understanding. Samuel and I started working together, and what we started to uncover, when he was young, he built up this system of needing beliefs, if you will. Needing people is dangerous. With a bit more exploration, we uncovered that his father, in some context, we could say loved him, but His father was unpredictable, very emotionally unpredictable, didn't know what mood he was going to be in. And that became very hard to manage. His father, who was emotionally abusive at times as well, became a scary for Samuel when he was a child. Samuel's nervous system learned, well, I can't I can't rely on dad because I've been hurt too many times. So I'll just pull back and look after myself. He made a decision. He's not going to rely on anybody else because that closeness, that intimacy, can't trust it. Can't trust people, and better off being alone. Samuel grew into an adult, and for 30 years, his adult life, he took on a persona like his not needing anybody, his independence, hyper independence, that it was strength. And he admired himself on his strength of being so independent. And he got compliments for it too. So it just reinforced it, as we know before. There was just an emptiness inside Samuel, and he couldn't but identified it as loneliness.
Mm.
It's not a word he would have used. It wasn't in his vocabulary in that sense, not for himself at least. He called it stress. He called it being tired or overworked. And maybe it's just because he's getting a bit older. But underlying it all was this loneliness because he had an absence of genuine connection. And he'd set that up himself and forgotten that he had.
I really like the word boundaries because, like, he obviously set up, probably tried the waters and tested out where it was safe and where it wasn't. And he got to this point where, he couldn't trust dad. And so he set this boundary over here, which meant he's created this safe space within there. And that obviously then prevented anyone coming too close, the people preventer. Am I right? Is that kind of...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what lies underneath that one?
Well,
Anything more?
there's for these people, and just like Samuel, that he, with his hyper independence, it was kind of this, well, if you want something done, do it yourself attitude. And that's how we lived. Just like we identified the fawn response for people pleasers, there's a nervous system for the people preventers. And this is basically emerges from what they call avoidant attachment. Exactly as it sounds. They avoid attachment because they've been hurt. Where a caregiver had let them down before, when a child had reached some vulnerability or expressed some sort of need and requirement, that they got met with criticism, dismissal, sometimes just absence, and in other cases, punishment. The parent that says, I'll give you something to cry about.
Yeah.
They're just aching to be loved and nurtured.
Mm.
So that child learns to stop reaching out, to stop craving their nurturing and support, and they work very hard to deactivate their attachment. And therefore the avoidant attachment style laid in two sides of the coin, the other side of the coin being their hyper independence. They themselves that they don't need connection, that they can do it on their own and they'll survive. In certain ways they do. But there's costs, because all this follows into adulthood, and the science is in, beyond any shadow of a doubt, everyone needs deep, genuine belonging. And people preventers aren't getting it.
Okay, so I've got a question for you, and it might be a little bit contrary, but self-reliance, isn't that a good thing? Right? It sounds good to me. Like self-reliance, you're not relying on other people. So there's got to be some kind of, I don't know, middle ground or other, yeah. How do you answer somebody that says, yeah, but self-reliance is a great thing?
And I'm chuckling away here because I have received exactly those sort of questions from my clients. It's an important question to ask. It's a real question. And this is where I need to push back on mainstream thinking that's out there, that self-reliance isn't the problem. Self-reliance can actually be very healthy and admired, and I admire it. Knowing how to function in this crazy world that we live in, that can be a little bit chaotic, a little bit messy at times. If you've got that self-reliance, can make your own decisions, carry your own weight, that's a good sign of maturity.
Yeah.
The difference that we're talking about in a people preventer sense is that those people are really rigid in their circumstances and they shut other people out. There's a difference between healthy self-reliance and unhealthy self-reliance. Healthy self-reliance is going to be a lot more flexible and know its limit. That person will say, hey, I can pretty well handle most things on my own. But they'll also know when they need additional help, and they will not be afraid to ask for additional help. The unhealthy self-reliance is going to refuse all help and never ask for it. Hyper-independence is rigid because that doesn't allow the person to ever need anyone or anything. So because they see needing as weakness and vulnerability as, well, dangerous. Healthy independence then, as a contrast, it allows that person to do a lot on their own and work out when they do require, and when it's more beneficial to sometimes be part of a community, part of a family, workforce, part of a team. There's got to be that balance, and I can have some independence within a family, within a team, a workforce. And that's probably one of the key distinctions, is the flexibility or the rigidity.
Yeah,
And
yeah, that does give a lot more understanding on, I guess, it's either the two terms that you've got are just the extremes of those particular people pleaser, people preventer. Are they that absolute though?
no, they're not. You know this too. I understand, Leanne, because we've had those wonderful conversations. People can be a bit of both. Most people have a predominant people pleaser behavior if they're still operating in their unhealthy behavior patterns, and they can be predominantly a preventer or predominantly a pleaser. Neither of them are permanent. That the beauty there of neuroscience says that our brains have neuroplasticity and they can be reprogrammed. We can create new neural pathways and learn to do things differently. The nervous system can have updates. Think of them like software programs. We can delete one and insert another one that's going to be a lot more beneficial.
Love that stuff. Love the neuroplasticity and the neuroscience around it. And knowing that
Absolutely.
this has come a long way in the last, years. Our parents growing up didn't know this stuff. It wasn't available to them. We're in a really, really important phase of understanding how we can certainly rewire some of these behaviors and beliefs and have much, healthier connections. But in the meantime, I guess, unless something's done, there can be damage done, right? And unless some healing happens, damage can continue to occur. And that's physical, not just emotional and mental health. Tell us a little bit more about the research.
The research is clear. There's the health consequences there, and it's supported by study after study that, for instance, people pleasers, they've got the chronic fawning happening, and what's associated with that is elevated and prolonged cortisol levels. When the cortisol levels are elevated for a prolonged period of time, that starts to suppress the system. That's where people have disruptive sleeps, gastrointestinal disorders, headaches, muscular pain, and the list goes on. They're feeling, their body is reacting to the distress that they're receiving in the emotional world. For the people preventers, for some, they can argue that it's even more severe because of their social isolation. And there's some amazing data out there, quite scary, in fact, of the effects of social isolation and emotional suppression. I've got some figures here, so I'm just going to share those with you, of the effects of social isolation, and it's associated with up to 50% increase in developing dementia, up to 29% increase of risk of heart disease, and up to 30% increase in a risk of stroke. Like, they're serious numbers, not to be ignored.
Incredible, isn't it?
Mm.
Something that you haven't mentioned, but I'd like to because I'm a lady, and you just mentioned cortisol as well. It has an incredible influence on the menopausal stage for women. And then that influx, changes the balance of all sorts of other hormones, which can then have further impact on these areas of the body and the mind and weight loss and confidence, etc. The list can continue. But if we understand that there's science to support and there's ways and solutions to get through that. So boundary issues, we shouldn't just dismiss them, because there's a lot of important data we can utilize to improve our boundaries to a healthy state with others and within ourselves.
True, true. A lot of people would have heard me before. I talk about emotional well-being, mental well-being, and physical well-being, and they're all intermeshed. You can't separate them. If there's an issue in one area, it's going to overflow into the other areas, or happen concurrently, in fact. Mentally, what can happen with both of these patterns of the pleasers and preventers, it can to burnout. The people pleasers are constantly looking out for others and giving of themselves, and then not replenished. These are the people that they've got expectations that others are going to look after them, and yet it's never been, they just end up in burnout. I've had a few clients and they tell me, I'm just being kind. I really enjoy being kind. And they're beautiful acts that are happening, the kindness. However, it's the motivators and drivers that are underneath, and that resentment that builds that has the chemical reactions side causing disease. They try harder, they do more, and it only exacerbates the problem. Because they've got these drivers saying, I've got to be accepted and I've got to avoid rejection.
Mm.
The people preventers, on the other hand, they burn out for different reasons, because they've got this whole lot of energy that they're expending cognitively and emotionally just to maintain their boundaries, their firm boundaries, and the avoidance of vulnerability and emotional expression. So for them, they don't have an emotional vocabulary. They don't have the body awareness. So they're not actually understanding what's happening inside them. I've asked a few people, I said, well, tell me, you said there's some sort of anger there, and how do you get it? And then they'll kind of go, oh, no, I don't really get angry, because their perception of it is only someone who gets really physically aggressive in some manner or form. And there's usually a lot of yelling and screaming associated with it. If they're not doing either of those things, the vocal part or the physical part, then they're not angry. And from their perceptions, gently, we start exploring all the different ways a person can be angry and how that they can recognize the signals in their body. And I've had a few of them like, oh, I don't do emotions. And I think you referenced that earlier. They just do the doing. Yeah. So they've got drivers of their hyper independence. And another thing is they can't trust people.
I had this visual in my mind of the person who's the people pleaser, and they're using all their own, they're using their own energy to help others. And there's the people preventer, and they're using all their energy to stop others. Either way, they're depleting of the healthy version of what could be having healthy relationships and having a balanced nervous system and having less stress and cortisol. They're using all their internals for everything else around them, and they become depleted. Tell us about healthy relationships, because that's what the goal is, I would think.
Yes, we're on healthy boundaries, and having the goal of having healthy boundaries isn't actually the right way to look at it, because what I see is healthy boundaries are actually the byproduct of something else. Healthy boundaries come about because they come from a person who's got a good sense of self, and that they've got self-worth. They know they've got that inherent worth. They don't just think it, but they feel it and know it. When it's happening at that level, there's a lovely mantra I love, and it's, you're lovable to exist. And when people feel into that just because they exist, that they're lovable and they embody it, then they're not out to do or prove anything. So they don't have to be super agreeable, or they don't have to be super, I don't need anyone. And their healthy limits then become more natural, because they're confident in who they are and determining what serves them and what doesn't. Healthy boundaries provide a lot more clarity. There's always way better communication happening, and they look at their boundaries as protection, but without punishment to anybody else. They move towards connection, and healthy connection we're talking about. And sometimes that can be uncomfortable, but because operating from their authentic self, they know it's the right thing to do. So the connections are more genuine.
Ah, actually, you said something then that just sounded so beautiful. And I think I got lost in that little moment of the happy, easy, yummy stuff of healthy boundaries. And yes, certainly the self-identity and being confident and having that clarity of self, knowing that they're lovable and they don't have to push and shove or deplete themselves just because there's another person in their field, in their environment. Yeah, you've identified some snappy ways of helping people with boundaries. You've told me about them, but I'll let you introduce those techniques that you've mentioned before. So not the readers, but so our hearers can benefit as well from your expertise.
Yeah, well, I've got a toolbox of things that I can call on to support customers in their healing journey. And ultimately, we're talking about healing emotional wounds, and that's the big internal work. However, I've got something, and this is just one thing, and think of it as a good entry point. And I call it the safe limits check, and limits boundaries. So the safe limits check, it's something that you and I have talked about, or Leanne, a pause, or that space between deciding what to do next. And the safe limits check, it's really an acronym, SAFE, and presents itself as 4 questions that can be used in certain circumstances before you respond to something, either with your default behavior of the open door, yes, or the closed door, no.
Yep.
So let's go through it. Safe. S is for literally safe, and asking yourself, is this emotionally, physically, or mentally safe for me? And an important distinction here is feeling safe and feeling comfortable are 2 different things. Sometimes I need to have a little bit of discomfort because discomfort doesn't equal danger. Is for authentic. Am I responding from my authentic self according to my values and needs, or am I responding from fear? So it's a good checkpoint, if you like. The fear of abandonment for the people pleaser and the fear of being hurt or controlled for the people preventer. So it's getting back, what does my authentic self need? The second or next part of that, which is really important, is F, and that is F is for fair. So is it fair to both me and the other person or people? And healthy boundaries need to account for all and have some compassion sometimes for the other party in a relationship. So they're not about me just having my own self-protection. I need to consider others and whether it's fair. And the E stands for expressive. So can I say what I need? What I need to say clearly and directly to the person who needs to hear it? Or am I falling back into a default pattern of my silence or compliance or shutdown? So how do I express myself and my needs? Even this at a beginning point can be quite confronting if you've not dealt with that sort of stuff before and looked through it with this lens. So the 4-step pause won't transform one of those patterns overnight. It just starts to create a gap so you can reflect on things a little bit more in between the trigger and the response. And in that gap, you get to choose something different maybe and see what's available to you. And through that, there could be some healing.
And in that gap, we've got the power to make, we can go either direction. We can fawn, we can freeze, we can run, do all of that, or we can choose something completely different that we haven't chosen before. And wow. Yeah. So are we offering something to our listeners and readers today? Are you offering them something that you can send to them from the safe? Give them a little toolkit?
Sure. If anyone wants to message me, I can give you the whole safe worksheet and lays out those 4 steps for your 4-step crawls.
Yeah, that's amazing. Because I know that you've been involved in a lot of men's work and you've been able to share boundaries workshops with them as well. And so you've actually had clients or workshopping techniques that you've been talking about today, which is fabulous. Is there anything that you wanted to add on that?
Absolutely. And yes, as you say, I've been involved in what is referred to as men's work, an organization called Men's Wellbeing for many years. I'm quite passionate about it. And so the next part I'm going to share, men, yet it's equally important for the women to hear this because as both genders, we need to understand each other. And so here's going to be some things that might be a little bit data is not ambiguous. And Australian research, it shows, and this will be reflected in society around the world, that for men who hold strong beliefs in the traditional masculinity, if you will, that self-reliance, the emotional stoicism and never needing anything, that there's studies that are showing that these people are the lonely ones. And there's a bracket there between 35 and 45, or anyway, that are really struggling with this. And I'm going to say I see it at all ages. Men account for 3 out of 4 suicides in Australia. That's huge. There's like up to 7 deaths a day, male deaths. And those don't happen in a vacuum. It's not just something a guy wakes up and says, I'm checking out today. So these things happen in a situation of disconnection, of isolation, and there's a script that's been playing for them that they shouldn't need anything else. And if they do, well, then they're less of a man and they stop showing up. So the people preventer pattern for some men, it's like a job description that they were handed. They didn't have a choice about it. They just said, here, this is what you have to do if you want to be a man. And it's damaging. It's really damaging. I've sat with many, many men over the years, sat in circle in different groups, and underneath that script of having to be so masculine is a person that just wants to be heard. They want to be known for who they are. They want to know themselves better, and they want connection. They don't always come out with these words, but underlying that's what's happening. So contrasting what they've grown up, having vulnerability, requiring support, and desiring meaningful connection, they're not weaknessing. This is a display of courage and compassion and strength. And so, yes, there's going to be some risks associated with driving a car down the street. So I look at these qualities: vulnerability, support, connection. I just say these are human existence. Men, women, we all need it.
We do. I remember years ago when we first started talking about this topic. I know you probably don't realize I'm going to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I've been working with lots of people. And then when I met you, you said, oh, you do this men's work. And I went, what the heck's men's work? Like, is that? I mean, I know women talk to women, but men? I didn't know that it existed, but it does. And I have to say, it is such a valuable environment. And if you didn't have that environment, we wouldn't be having these wonderful, deep conversations, and you wouldn't have a connection with all the beautiful men that you also have friendships with as well. So for anybody that might be recognizing themselves in these particular people pleaser or people preventer traits and behaviors, as you've mentioned today, Nicholas, what's the first step they can do? Is it the safe limits check? Is that the first thing, or is there something else?
No, it's not. Because what is the reason they're going to reach out for doing something like the safe limits check and asking themselves those 4 questions is there's a step back from that. Right at the beginning, it's recognition of what's happening and has been happening, and without shame. Without shame, without guilt, and without blame. And that's really it. So I say recognition without shame, important first, and just sit with that probably. That can be enough for people. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to know what change looks like at this stage, but just having that recognition and being honest about it. So we talked about the fawn response and the hyper-independence, trauma response, and in some ways they may appear as opposites, but they're not, because they really stem from the same sort of emotional wounding where their self had learned that it wasn't safe to be themselves, who they really are. And it forms emotional wounds and whatever. I just want people to know it wasn't your fault. This was just your survival strategy. And, it's important so what happens next? Well, I guess you get to choose that. If you're ready to have further conversations, I'd love to be a part of your hinge.
I love what you just said then. The little child didn't know any different, and that was a survival strategy. In fact, cheering them on because they actually did make a choice back then, but it's probably an outdated thing. There's some updating that can happen, and thanks for the invitation for those who really want to reach out, because you've got a lot of experience and authority around this. And if change is what they want, then are those people that they can reach out to and explore a little bit more. That's amazing. So yeah, like what else is there? Nicholas, what else is there? Where can people find you? Where can they learn more? Where can they start to investigate and do a little bit of personal looking into? Where can they find you?
I'm always happy to connect and answer questions. I think one of the easiest ways is to go to my website, which is Zest, ZESTQUEST, zestquest.com.au. And if you want to take action, then it's pretty easy. Now button, click on that, and you'll get a free 45-minute rapport session with me. And I believe that a healing journey just starts with a conversation. And this free session gives you a relaxed opportunity to build rapport, to share some information, and understand how I work, and then decide whether I'm the right fit for you. And if you look at today's conversation, if it stirred something you're not sure, that's okay. Just sit with that for a bit longer and process it. And that can be enough for where you're at right now. Or if you want to come back to me, the door's always open.
Nicholas Dob, thank you so much. It's always good to have these deep, meaningful conversations, especially because other genuine people need to hear what it is that you have to offer. So with that, thank you very much.
Pleasure to share this information with you and our listeners. And your input is always valued. Your questions put me sometime, which I love, because it's good to think of the different angles. So thank you, everybody. And in parting, wishing you less stress and more zest.